Hello and welcome. Our guest today is Amb Weekes, Senior Business Advisor at the Ottawa office of the Canadian law firm Bennett Jones. For nearly 3 decades, Ambassador Weekes stood at the center of Canadian trade policy. He was ambassador to the WTO for Canada in the 90s, and before that, he was the ambassador for Canada to the GATT. During his 2 tenures, he served as the General Counsel Chair for the WTO, and he served as Chair of the GATT Council in 1989 and the contracting parties of GATT in 1990. Ambassador Weekes is the only person to serve in all of those capacities. Amb Weekes, welcome.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
When you were negotiating the Uruguay round, the negotiation that led to the formation of the WTO and in fact changed the global trading system, which issues did you consider to be the most challenging in terms of finding consensus among the 123 contracting parties as they were then?
Well, I think in a sense, the biggest issue was finding out how did you make a deal attractive for 123 parties. And, each country had certain pieces of that deal that were particularly important to them or difficult for them. Canada was schizophrenic, for instance, on agriculture. We wanted big results in some areas of agriculture, and we wanted to protect certain other agricultural sectors like dairy. But across the board, the problem was really how did you put together a deal that had something in it for everybody, something that everybody found of value and was important to them. And I think in the final analysis, people talk about trade-offs in negotiations. I think that's a wrong way to think about negotiations, because if you start thinking about trade-offs, that's giving things away that are important to you. No governments like to do that. They want to get things that are beneficial to them. And the way you make a deal is by putting something that's attractive for everyone on the table, rather than telling them that they're going to have to give up on this and give up on that.
Now, many people say that the idea of creating the WTO, this came a little bit late in the negotiating process, and many people think it's Canada who deserves credit for this. Why was it so important to these 123 members at that time to bring the WTO into being?
Well, I think there were different reasons for this. And it's certainly true that the Canadian minister of the day, John Crosbie, delightful man, very effective, from Newfoundland, he thought it was really important to look at taking the GATT out of its infancy, really. The GATT, after all, was a provisional agreement. It was never even a really completed agreement. It was an agreement applied provisionally for over 40 years. And it seemed to a lot of people in Canada that it made sense to move the GATT forward and turn it into something that had greater permanency. And so we did come up with this proposal for creating a World Trade Organization. After all, there were proposals back at the very beginning, at the time of the Havana Charter at the end of the war, for creating an international trade organization that would be like the IMF or the World Bank. But that floundered because it was clear that the American Congress wasn't going to approve anything that was too ambitious, or that the Senate wouldn't. And so they pulled out the articles of the GATT, the sort of core trade agreement parts of the Havana Charter, and turned that into the GATT and applied it provisionally. And with a 60-day withdrawal clause, by the way. The other thing was, as people got close to the end of the Uruguay round, it became apparent, and Arthur Dunkel, the then Director General, made this clear in conversations he started having with people. In that negotiation, we were really negotiating issues that went beyond the traditional boundaries of the GATT: trade and services, intellectual property related matters. These things there was no way you could sort of incorporate them in the GATT as it stood. So you needed something that was broader than just the GATT structurally in order to house the results of the negotiation.
But how has the WTO held up, do you think, over these 25 years?
Well, I'm going to start by saying we can talk about the WTO, but the WTO is really its members. And And I don't, and back at the time of the WTO, I mean, this was, the end of history. The Cold War had come to an end. We were looking forward into this new vision of where we were going. And I don't think anybody anticipated the sort of populist, anti-globalist troubles that we've gotten into. And so that's not a fault of the WTO as such, but that's a feature of how thinking has evolved in a number of countries that has created problems for the management of the organization.
Well,
Another thing I'd like to say, it's been very hard to get a discussion in this organization, a policy discussion about anything. So, that if you think, here's some important current developments, let's have a discussion of that in the General Council, for instance. People will say, oh, no, we can't do that. There's a worry that if we start talking about that, maybe you'll then say we need to negotiate that. And maybe somebody is going to impose rules on me in regard to this. So there's been a real reluctance to talk about anything that goes beyond the sort of administration of the agreement.
Interestingly, Susana Malcorra, the former foreign minister of Argentina, who chaired our last ministerial conference, picked up on exactly that and forced the membership to have a conversation along those lines.
And this was at ministerial level.
Yes, that's right.
That's probably easier at ministerial level than at the level of ambassadors.
Maybe
here in Geneva. But good for her. But one area where the organization has been, I think, really very successful as an organization is in the area of the trade policy review process. And that indeed has been broadened out by Pascal Lamy when he was Director General to allow, after the financial crisis, reporting on developments in the field of trade that were taking away from the liberalization, rolling back. And that is, I think that was very good. That's a place where the members were prepared to say, okay, there was already the power there to for the Director General to prepare an annual report reviewing developments in the field of trade, and he really took that kernel and built it out more broadly. And because of the dramatic nature of the situation then, we appeared we could be on the brink of something very serious in the economic area, the membership was prepared to go along with that.
Yeah.
And it's still going on now. Those reports are still taking place.
How would you characterize the political environment today as it relates to 1995 and perhaps the years in between? How would you assess that?
Well, if you look at the last few years, I mean, who would have predicted some of the things that have happened? Even if you go back to, say, the beginning of 2015, who would have thought that the United Kingdom was going to vote to leave the European Union? Who would have thought that the country, which had been the leader in terms of creating a rules-based trading system and expanding on it and moving it forward, would appear to turn its back on that process? And that's essentially what happened with the election of Donald Trump and the administration that he's put together. That would have seemed very unlikely. But I think there's been a drift over a number of years. People were complaining about trade. I mean, a lot in a successive American elections and in other elections too. People complain about, NAFTA and how it was a bad agreement, needed to be negotiated. Nobody really did anything about it, but it kind of drifted on in a sort of political limbo, tolerated politically, but not thought of very highly. And I think to some extent the WTO is beginning to suffer from some of this same problem. Now the good thing that I think has occurred now is, when Donald Trump started talking about tearing up the NAFTA, and repeatedly talking about it, and then putting on tariffs, and now withdrawing from the WTO, it's actually forced Americans to think, this guy seems to be serious. They didn't really believe any of this talk before. If he's serious, what is this going to mean for us? How's it going to affect my business? Is it going to adversely affect my workers, my community? What's this going to mean for my job? What's this going to mean for my state, my community? So there's been a lot of thinking about this over the last 2 years in the United States. And I've seen it, watched it more closely because of the NAFTA negotiations, because I've been involved advising people on that. But I think it's also happening with respect to the WTO. And the good answer here is that a lot of Americans have suddenly realized that, that trade is good for them, that these agreements are actually good for them, that they're making their communities more prosperous, that they're benefiting from trade. And they'd never, and I think it's the first time in over a decade that there's now beginning to be, at a sort of that kind of level, a public sentiment in favor of open trade.
You mentioned the president and some of the things he said vis-a-vis the WTO, and one of the things he said is that there is a need for the WTO to shape up. When you look at the WTO and you think of the question of reform, how might this come about, and what areas are in greatest need of bolstering in your view?
Well, I think that a lot of members in the organization are realizing that the organization's in a certain amount of trouble. I mean, nobody really expected the United States would begin to turn on its own works of the post-war period in the way that's happening. So this is forcing a lot of countries, some of whom may have enjoyed over some period of time taking pot shots at the US or the EU and saying they didn't really benefit from the organization. But sort of like Americans I was talking about a few minutes ago, they're now having to think, hey, well, wait a minute, if this organization's really in trouble, would I prefer to live in a world with or without the WTO? And I think they're gradually coming to the conclusion that, hey, actually this WTO is probably a pretty good thing for a number of reasons. And of course, the world is more and more integrated. Trade is more and more important for all countries, including the United States. That's one of the great ironies, too. You know, if you go back to the early 1970s, the United States was more powerful, relatively speaking, in the world. It accounted for a larger share of world trade, but trade accounted for a much smaller proportion of American gross domestic product than it does today, by I think a factor of 3 or 4. So this is quite ironic. The United States turning hostile on the global trading system at a time when it has less power than it used to, but when it's much more dependent on international trade. Doesn't make a lot of sense.
No, in terms of the WTO
Yes.
and its ability to function as an effective mechanism for overseeing the global trading system, what needs to be done to enhance that?
Well, I think the first thing is the members have to take a look at how do they work together more effectively again, because the WTO is really about the members. And, you know, let's face it, we've had a multilateral negotiation in the Doha round that was not entirely successful in terms of bringing about a meeting of minds. And I think one of the problems there, when I think back on it, back on the last 40 or 50 years, actually, that if, you know, that we didn't really prepare properly for the Doha round in a way. If you go back and look at the run-up to the Uruguay round that led to the formation of the WTO, the Uruguay round was launched in 1986 at a meeting of ministers in Punta del Este. 4 years before that, there was a meeting here in Geneva of GATT ministers, the 1982 ministerial meeting, that was felt by almost everybody who was there at the time to have been a catastrophe. The press widely reported it as a disaster. It led, you know, Lester Thurow to go off to subsequent Davoses and say the GATT is dead repeatedly, which didn't turn out to be the case. But what that sparked was a work program that took place very broadly in the GATT, but the OECD, the World Bank, the UNCTAD, and independently in think tanks and business involvement, business thinking about what did you really need for a trade agreement that was appropriate to the final part of the 20th century. We're now a bit on from that. In a sense, I think that's the last time we really had a real hard look at what did we really need for the trading system of that day. And we did do some preparation for the Doha round, but it was nothing on the scale of what we did back then. So I think we need to be doing something on that sort of scope today. Now, we know a lot of the issues we know that need to be addressed. They're the same old issues that we didn't finish in the Uruguay round, that we didn't finish in the Doha round. Agriculture and agricultural support programs would be a good example. But it's also true, you know, when you look at digital commerce and these things, I think that there are a lot of new issues too.
What is it that's happened over the course of these last 20, 25 years that has been the biggest surprise to you, would you say?
The evolution of thinking in governments along the lines I was talking about earlier, this sort of fear of globalization and the rise of populism, if I could call it that. But in addition to that, on the one hand, the dispute settlement system in the WTO, I think, has been more successful than I thought it would be at the time. It's been extraordinarily successful. At the same time, the negotiating function has been extraordinarily unsuccessful.
And that's a surprise to you.
And that's a surprise. And that's now created, I think, an inevitable tension problem.
Are the two things linked? The success of dispute
to
settlement?
No, I don't
difficulties?
I don't think they're linked, but I think they're now linked in the sense that that's part of why people are turning on the dispute settlement system. I remember a few years ago making the analogy. It's as if you shut down the Congress and kept the Supreme Court busy, and the Supreme Court started making rulings on matters that had never been considered by Congress because, you know, there are new issues there. And this is the kind of world we're getting into. And clearly in a body that operates on the basis of consensus, you can't have the court system determining what the new rules are going to be. And I think not that that's happening in a major way, but starting to happen around the edges. And clearly the system does need updating given all the changes that are there. I mean, we found this with the NAFTA. It's a contemporary agreement really with the WTO. You know, there was no electronic commerce when we negotiated the NAFTA. You know, customs forms were still done on paper. Now it's all digital.
No one had a cell phone or email address.
That's right.
Ambassador John Weekes, thank you for being with us, and thanks to you for watching.